Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. We will start in just a moment. I'm just seeing quite a few windows still with connecting to audio, so we're just giving people a bit of a second. Okay. Excellent. I think most of those have connected now. Yurathumara, hi everyone. It's my pleasure today to welcome everyone to today's event as part of the Family Matters Week of Action. My name is Paul Gray. I'm a Wiradjuri man and currently serving as co-chair of the Family Matters National Leadership Group. I'd like to start, of course, by acknowledging country. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm zooming in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who have cared for this country for thousands of generations. I know we have people calling in from all over today, so I want to extend my respect to all nations and acknowledge their ongoing custodianship of country. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today for what I'm sure will be a very interesting and important conversation about keeping our kids connected to culture, to family, and to community. It's great to be able to host this session with our speakers, Joe Kelly from Kinchilla Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation, Jenny Parsons from Quatsip, and Jacinta Krakauer, a social work researcher and academic, and my colleague from the Family Matters Leadership Group. Just a few quick words regarding this event. We are recording this event and it will be uploaded to the Family Matters and the Snake YouTube channels later. We are also live streaming right now on the Family Matters Facebook page. So right now you can text all your friends and colleagues who didn't get around to registering and tell them to join us over there to be able to watch along. We do encourage you to keep your videos on during the event. If you are on a computer or laptop, you can set your scene to gallery view so that you can see most people by clicking the button up in the top right. You can also add your name or your organization's name or your people, your country, by clicking on the three dots at the top right-hand side of the screen. We encourage you to use your full names, and if you're representing an organization or a community, please include that with your name. The chat function will be on throughout the event. And in particular, you can message our fantastic tech support people, Zareen, who's helping us out. So if you're having any challenges, please get in touch with Zareen, who will be able to help you out. The chat function is also how we will be facilitating the question and answer section towards the end of the session. So later we'll call for any questions from the audience. Just pop them in the chat and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Finally, for those of you who are on Twitter, please go and follow the Family Matters Twitter account and use the hashtag for the week of action, which is #OurMobsMatter. We know that connection to family, community, culture, and country is at the core of well-being for our kids. A key principle of the Family Matters campaign is protecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders children's right to live in culture. To paraphrase the inaugural Victorian Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, Andrew Jacomos, culture is not a perk for First Nations children, it is a lifeline. In social and emotional wellbeing models advanced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, connections to family, community, culture, and country are key foundations. We cannot promote the safety, welfare, and well-being of our kids without understanding and nurturing these critical connections. Today, we're really lucky to be able to learn from some experts in the field about how we can ensure our kids are able to meaningfully enjoy their rights to family, community, culture, and country that are central to who they are and that are central to their lifelong well-being. I'm very pleased to be able to start today by introducing our first speaker, Joe Kelly. I've been really fortunate to see Jo's work up close, and it's really amazing. I'm excited to have her share her knowledge with us today. Jo is a proud Dunghutti woman, born and raised on the Macleay River in Kempsey. She is the youngest of 11 children and mum to 2 adult children. She has a Master of Arts in Indigenous Social Policy, Bachelor of Teaching, Diploma in Management, and a Diploma in Project Management. She has experience working in the trauma-informed space and family research, with a demonstrated history of working with individuals and family services industry. She's skilled in social policy, change management, leadership development, community development, engaging with government, culture and heritage, building community capacity, and program management. She's currently working with Kinchilla Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation as a project manager, community initiatives, and is overseeing the Kempsey Transition Program, Indigenous Youth Connecting to Culture, and NDIS Access Program. Thanks, Jo.
Thanks for that, Paul. And it's Yahweh from here, from Kempsey, sitting in the beautiful Macleay Valley while we do this. I'm just going to try and do my PowerPoint as well and look at sharing that on the screen. 2 seconds and I'll be with you to begin with. So yeah, so again, thanks for the introduction, Paul. I'm excited to be here today. I'm going to talk about a couple of things and projects that I've been involved in the last 5 years. But before I start, can I also do an acknowledgement that I come from the traditional lands of the Dunghutti people where I'm sitting today, and also acknowledge the panelists and everybody sitting here where they're coming from as well. I want to pay respect to my elders and the past and present and emerging, as well as acknowledge the members of the stolen generations. The candle in my PowerPoint represents the light and hope for our communities as we deal with many issues that affect our communities on a daily basis. So just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about briefly is just reflecting back on some of the things in the last 30, 40 years, working particularly in community in the last 5 years, some of the projects and community initiatives that we're embarking on now. Just looking at some of the stuff around reflecting on what used to be. There's many things that we talk to in community about what happened, particularly in Kempsey in the last 30 to 4 years, around how families were closer, how there was a lot more sharing and caring in family, the closeness of the community as well. So we didn't have to worry about being in trouble with anybody, because if you did something wrong, you've dealt with a number of people along the way rather than how it is today. The role of family was important, and it was normal for us to look at how we would deal with issues again, but also normal for us as a family to go with 8 carloads out to the river to go fishing on a weekend. And that seemed to be normal, where the children would be in one place and our parents and elders and aunties and uncles and grandparents were fishing at another end. Some of the issues that have been impacting our community, which is, not new to anybody sitting here too, there's a whole lot of stuff around domestic and family violence. There's a whole lot of stuff around the increased use of drug and alcohol use. But what we're seeing happening is that it's becoming more and more in the face today than what it had been in the past. There's also a number of services that are funding in our community. Again, this is not just generic to this community, but the funded programs aren't hitting the ground. We know they're here, but we need to find out where they are. But one of the key questions that we constantly ask is, when did things start to change? When we look at how did the things go from being really connected to the social disconnect that we currently have now? So in the last 5 years, I've been fortunate to work across a number of different organisations, in culture and heritage, in a local land council, in out-of-home care, doing family research, and now trauma-informed space, but now working on the ground with descendants of the stolen generation and their families, and how do we look at the trauma that they've experienced. One of the uncles in particular, Uncle Whitty, he's constantly talking about the importance of family structure and how there's been a big disconnect there, and we have to get that back so that our families, our children and our community and culture can come back together to what it once was. Some of the things that we've noticed is around the limited cultural knowledge that some of our community have. And again, that's not any fault of their own, it's all about past policies and procedures and government, but how do we change that as well? And with that limited cultural knowledge, there's also that disconnected culture, where we don't do what the past practices used to be. You know, there's now that revival around language, which we're starting to do. But you know, if we have the language being taught in our preschool, when they go home, the children aren't able to discuss that because their families and their parents don't know the language. So how do we have that and impact that to grow that? So we're looking at initiatives to grow, connect and or reconnect back to culture. So two projects in particular, and one Paul mentioned before, is I worked with Department of Community and Justice to look at a tool for kids in out-of-home care around Aboriginal Cultural Connections questionnaire. This tool is around about 12 questions that focus purely on who they are, where they're from. One of the things that we wanted to make sure is that by the time the child either transitions back to being restored or are old enough to go back to their communities, if we provided them with a tool to allow that they can confidently speak about who they are, where they're from, who their mob is, their family structures, then that would be a way to set them up so that at the moment, there's children who don't know any of that stuff, but also use it as a tool to grow their knowledge and basis. So that tool's been around for a while. For the last 18 months, it's been in a pilot stage. It's rolling out across 3 external providers, and then, you know, growing the caseworkers as well to give them confidence about how they deal with it, with the ultimate aim that once they complete that questionnaire, that can then form their cultural support plan that they will be then used to again work out where they're up to with their culture, and also assist schools with that too. Schools are doing a lot of cultural stuff. A current project that I'm working on is about Indigenous youth connecting to culture. And this is one of 12 sites across Australia, and we're the only one in New South Wales at this point in time. This was funded by by NIA, the National Indigenous Australian Agency. So we're currently in the process of, we've been having discussions with at least 150 young people about what are the issues affecting them, both culturally, socially and emotionally, and wellbeing tools. We've had 4 schools visits. We're working with young Aboriginal people in the workforce, young Aboriginal people unemployed or looking for work, looking at young people with disabilities. So there's a whole cohort, but also having conversations with elders and service providers and community about what they think is important as well. So the tool that we've developed for that is purely around online as well as butcher's paper. So the online stuff is all that social emotional wellbeing and individual information, which is all anonymous. And then the other part of that is around the cultural stuff. So we actually ask the young people, what was it like when their grandparents was growing up? What did the local culture look like? To what does local culture looks like now? And what do they want it to be like when they're a grandparent? So we're going back, we're looking at now, we're going forward. Some of the comments that are coming back are really interesting in terms of they're saying, yes, we want culture. We want to do it, but first and foremost, we want to make sure that it's delivered locally, it's delivered by our own community, and it's delivered by our own mob. We won't engage in stuff when it's a non-Aboriginal person because that defeats the purpose of growing our own culture. So some of the other stuff that are coming up around the social issues is the stuff that I mentioned earlier on around domestic and family violence. It is around racism in particular, about lack of employment and education opportunities in community and small towns. So how do we look at moving forward with that? We're going to be developing an action plan that will be signed off by all layers of government ultimately, and then to develop collaborations with current organisations in our community to help implement those. So some of the stuff that's coming up is around cultural camps, learning language, looking at language immersion camps and all of that stuff. At a community level, we have what we call Kempsey Healing Together Events Community. This was established in 2016. It's a collaboration between Aboriginal organisations, non-government organisations and government. And from 2016, we've hosted over 25 events in community that are all done to different target groups and different focus areas, but it's all funded within self. So we've been able to raise sponsorship, like, you know, and I'll talk a bit about a couple of them now before I finish my presentation. So one of the things that we've done is we've looked particularly at the cultural activities. The carp frenzy that we have, we did up at Bellbrook, which is a small town outside of Kempsey, 45-minute drive. and they had an issue with carp coming into the river system. So what we've done is we engaged with the local community up there. We had one of the local guys develop some spears, and so we took a group of young people out on country and they walked a 3-kilometre river system looking for carp to get that out, because then that was a way of trying to get them to look at some cultural stuff. Along that 3-kilometre journey, they also did some stories about country, and they stopped at different places along the way. The second thing that we've done is around Let's Go Fishing Comp. So we've been trying to do this, and unfortunately we didn't in the last school holidays because it was flooded, and it wasn't the best time to go fishing. So, but we do this every school holidays as a way of trying to connect them back to culture. Because as I said earlier on, in our family, we used to go fishing all the time. It was normal for 8 carloads to go, but unfortunately in today's society, that's not the case in our community. So some of our kids never been fishing before. We provide them with the tools, we provide them with the fishing rods and worms, and we have those conversations. Some of the stuff that we've also done is it's normal to see at least 3 generations sitting on the riverbank fishing together, and they're sharing their stories about everything. So we do have prizes at the end of it for the biggest fish, the littlest fish, and the one that got away. And that story starts them thinking about bits and pieces. But in a minute, I'll show a little video about culture in the park. So that's been going for the last since the beginning of last year, where we try and do initiatives in the park down at the riverside. We get people to do weaving, we get dancing, we get didge playing, we get storytelling, and we get language groups sitting down there. And so they're all sharing bits and pieces. But I'll get Zareen to show a quick video, and this will just give you a little bit, and then I'll wrap up my presentation. It's not the best of videos, but it's something that I'll put together quickly.
Sorry, just gonna make sure I share the audio. My apologies.
While we're sorting out the audio, this is just a quick example. Oh, hang on.
Come down here for a spell. We're going to tell you some stories. Come down to where we live and I'll show you around. We're the Dungutty people, and this valley is our home. The mountains, the river, the sea, it's all part of us, connecting us to it and each other. We were born from this land and sustained by this river. It forms who we are. And as the river is our lifeblood, this mountain might be our heart. When we see it looking over us, we know we are where we belong. The Macleay River winds its way down the valley, joining our communities through Bellbrook, Greenhill, Kempsey, Taruka, Burnbridge, and meets the sea at Southwest Rocks. We lived here for a long time. And now it's time for we elders to pass on our knowledge of this land and our history here to a new generation.
Ready? Nianen waju, nianen dilang, nianen manang dilang bari, nianen balin, waju gamba, neya ninda, nianen Australian. We are one, but we are many. And from all the lands on earth we come, we share a dream and sing with one voice. I am, you are, we are Australian.
Thank you for that. So that just gives a quick snapshot of some of the stuff that we do for culture in the park. One of the things that we want to do is we've got to start growing it, and we have to start with our babies. And that's why the kids at Greenhill Public School are happy to do that dance and move forward, because as I said, if we can't grow it, we've got to try and reconnect. But we start with them, then they're going to be confident in their culture moving forward. And, you know, that's where we have to start. So thank you for listening, and I'm more than happy to take questions later on. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Joe. Always great to see that vision of young people getting involved and enjoying participating with elders and on country. It's fantastic. I'd like now to introduce Jenny Parsons, a Kamilaroi and Sector Development Officer with our friends, the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Protection Peak. Jenny spent her formative years growing up in Tamworth and raised her family of 3 boys there. Jenny moved to the Northern Territory in 2007 and spent 6.5 years working in management roles for Mission Australia in employment and community services across the top end. These years working in remote communities hold a special place in Jenny's life, both professionally and personally, and have directed her path toward where she is today. Jenny also spent 12 months working with the Department of Immigration as a case manager in the detention centre network in Darwin. She relocated to far north Queensland in 2014 and shortly after commenced as an executive manager for family services at Millawum, an Aboriginal medical service working across the tablelands. In her role with QATSEP, Jenny has enjoyed the opportunity to support member services and work with services in the child protection sector to improve outcomes for First Nations children and families. And I understand Jenny has a PowerPoint presentation for us today.
Thank you. So before I struggle with technology, I'm just going to pay my respects to the land on which I'm sitting today, which is from the Yagara and Turrbal Nations. I have the opportunity of being 11 stories up overlooking the Gabba in Brisbane, which is the head office of the Kotsip organisation. But I live and work in Mariba on the Tablelands, which is Mularigi country. I'd also like to pay my respects to my adopted Jabbergai family. But in respect to my presentation, I need to respect and acknowledge the 5 generations of grandmothers, Aboriginal grandmothers that undertook this work initially. It's not my work. I pay respects to them for allowing me the permission to involve this process for a little boy in my work. But I also have to particularly acknowledge Colleen Wall, who gave me permission to actually undertake that process. So please, I really need you to understand that it's a process, not my work. So I'm going to do this, share my screen, and we'll continue from there. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this work. When I was given the opportunity over a year ago to undertake some sensitive work for a child in care, it was around family mapping that unfortunately wasn't actually completed in a 4-year process that this child had been in care. He'd been taken at birth. I'm not going to give a lot of information because we have so many people on, and I don't want to share information that would particularly identify this family. However, we had a very small amount of time to halt a legal application that would, in essence, disconnect this child for the rest of his life from his cultural family and connection to country. So it was actually Kotsip person that sort of thought I might be able to undertake this work. The first thing that happened in this work was understanding that I might be an Aboriginal woman, but I didn't have cultural authority on the land on which I was working to undertake the work. So I set about thinking, well, how on earth would I actually be able to do that? So given some thought, I approached a traditional owner, an elder woman, and asked permission, would she be able to undertake this work with me so that we could do it with the cultural authority and respect that it required. And so she agreed. And I think spiritually and from ancestors, we were given a path that has led to the work that I'm going to speak about. So it speaks to the work of a collective group of women who developed a specific document and process that gives a clear cultural and kinship guide to some work. It was initially presented in the Children's Court, but now we can say it's been given permission to be provided in the child safety protection space in court. I've already said that this document needs to be the intellectual property and remains the intellectual property of First Nations grandmothers, and it's to be used by them, for them, on country, and to the benefit of their people, which is our mob, our kids. So 5 generations of grandmothers gave a paper to the Family Law Court in 2014. And it led to a long discussion about the resourcefulness, the responsibility in our culture of our grandmothers in raising children, both male and female, until they're of age. So in conjunction with this work, the 2014 expert report was actually initiated, and it led to the reform of the Australian Indigenous Action Plan for 2014 and 2016 in the Family Law Courts. And I think that's a massive thing to lay a groundwork for things that we can continue. Grandmother's law defines our relationship, which we already know is to country flora and fauna. So I'm not going to go into these slides in depth. You can read them, but I'm just acknowledging the understanding that we all have that this is a sovereignty issue. Our connections are not just given to us, they belong to us. I often talk that, we talk about the introduction of self-determination in laws and processes and policies and things that we're in frameworks. but my personal opinion of that is you didn't have the right to take away my self-determination, so you certainly don't have the right to give it back to me. This is about our sovereignty, and it's about reclaiming the cultural authority that grandmothers have in raising our mob, our children, and keeping them safe and connected. The story morphs a little bit, so I'm going to go through why the family, the grandmother's law is done the way it is because it actually links our cultural authority law to all of the government strategies that currently exist. So this is nothing new. We're only actually presenting it in a way that says, if you're going to do this for our kids, this is actually the way you said you would do it, but this is the way that we're connecting it to our culture and the responsibilities that we have and the expectation that we have of the work that you're doing for our children. So it actually aligns with our way strategy. It aligns with even, the Family Matters works, all the strategic plans that our Queensland government and national governments actually purport to support our children. It aligns with everything, including the international rights of a child. And recently in Queensland, we had the Human Rights Act of Queensland enacted in 2019. So it's nothing new. And the work that I think is important in this is that we're going to place a child. If the child protection system wants us to say, this is who this child is, this is where he belongs, this is a process that we can demand. And it also aligns with everything. And we're saying to a magistrate, this is what you need to see. You don't need to see a white man's view of who this child is and where he belongs. You need to actually use this process. And this is where this kid is. And this is how we know this is this child and where he belongs. This will then dictate the education and his access to culture and country for the life of the document. So whilst this is really a document that I feel can be used for children who are currently in out of home care, I believe it has wider context as well, if applied. So for this little fella, it had been 4 years in care, and the usual comments of, oh, the family don't turn up to contact, we can't ever get them on the phone, they don't do this, they don't do that, they don't do something else, so it's all their fault why we haven't actually completed family mapping. So by using the lady that had the cultural authority to start asking the right questions to the right people, it was 2 weeks in to this process, and we only had 4 weeks to put in a halt to the application to court that was going forward. So time was of the essence. So 2 weeks in, when we hadn't been able to contact the family successfully, the lady said, hey, Jen, do you think we could actually just pop round to where they live? And I went, well, yeah, do you think that would be okay? She said, yep, let's give that a go. So we got in a car one morning and we popped around, and the family were there. We introduced ourselves and why we were there. And do you mind if we have a bit of a yarn about that? So we were invited into the carport space where there was a lounge chair, there was grandma, there was uncle, auntie, and a little fella cousin of the little boy that we were talking about. And cutting right to my heart, the first thing that they actually asked of me was, do you know how he is? Because we haven't seen him since he was a baby. This is not a family who didn't care. This is not a family who just chose not to answer phone calls. This is not a family who chose not to turn up to contact. The thing that stuck with me most was that the family lived 5 blocks away from the Child Safety Service Centre. I'd never met these people, never spoken to them, and it was okay for me to rock on up, knock on the door respectfully and say, hey, this is why I'm here. Do you think we can have a yarn? So by identifying the bloodline grandmother initially, the benefits to the process of family mapping is that she has the cultural authority to place this child and to give out the information that often isn't readily available or spoken to by the Child Safety Service Centres or even CPAs and CSOs. So I think the difference here was that even though she wasn't able to step up and look after this child, didn't mean her cultural authority should have been removed from the process. So the documents that I'm showing you are just that. How does this cultural process actually align? It aligns perfectly with every document that you can possibly find in every state that reasons why children should be connected to culture. children should be connected to family. Children should be connected to community. So we're just giving those examples of how you can actually link this process. So the plan is based on the First Nations Grandmother's Law concept and how we actually, as I said, place the children. Even if they're living off country in out-of-home care, they deserve to know where they actually belong. This process can also be used to actually support them if they live on someone else's country, and how we can actually contact community grandmas and support the process of, okay, well, what are the protocols and what are the cultural knowledges that I might need to know for this child growing up on another country, as well as connection to his country, because there are still protocols that children need to know in those spaces as well. We're always working towards reuniting this child home. Whether the child stays in out-of-home care to the 18, runs away at 14, what are they running away to? They're trying to find home. So we want to actually ensure for the life of the child in out-of-home care or their involvement with child safety systems, that they're actually connected right from the beginning as soon as we can. So what do we need to do? We need to locate bloodline grandmas or matriarchal systems. We need to get community grandmas. If we can't find a bloodline grandma, we need to find the cultural authority in this family who can speak on behalf of the family to place this child correctly. It even, we've mentioned the Human Rights Act, there it is. So this process can actually be defended in court on many, many levels. It hasn't, you know, it's already been tested. Let's use it. Let's use it to the event that when we're getting a cultural plan for this child, it doesn't have 2 sentences. And the cultural plan that came out of this process was 29 pages long, and I didn't identify one event that the child had to go to. What I did was link the family's grandma's law process of identifying the child, then into the cultural plan process, and said, well, every step of this cultural plan needs to actually align with this process. Otherwise, it's not a significant cultural plan that belongs to this child. So how many times have we seen cut and paste? So little did I know while I was undertaking this process that my own personal experience was actually going to intertwine. So 2 months before undertaking this process for this child, I actually found out that I had a grandson in care myself in New South Wales, and I live in far north Queensland. He was about to turn 2 years old and we did not know he existed. So every 170 hours that was put into this work, lo and behold, Grandma's name was Grandma Jenny. So as I got deeper and deeper into this work, it became genetically imprinted because it was actually my experience as well. How are we going to place this child? They didn't know he was Aboriginal until they found me. They said they were so excited to find me. And I said, well, I wasn't lost. I was never lost. So what are you going to do now? So I went down to meet him, and 2 weeks later, unbeknownst to me, they took out long-term orders. So it's been a 3-year fight ever since to establish my own grandmother's law authority in the life of this child who's now in care. So I think what this work has done for me on many levels is said, it's not hard to prove why we have the cultural authority that we have. We've always had it. That's why I talk about the self-determination. You don't need to give it back to me. I already had it. I've never lost it. We've never lost the sovereignty of this land. As grandmothers, we've never lost the authority to have the authority to educate our children and connect them. But unfortunately, the systemic stuff that we've put up with for generations has taken that away from us, and now we have to fight to get it back. I guess I'm sitting here humbly speaking on behalf of many generations of grandmas. There were 5 generations of grandmas that did this work initially. So I'm speaking on behalf of them and all the other grandmas, my grandmas, your grandmas, to say we need to stand up. We already know there's Grandmothers Against Removal. We already know there's a Sovereign Grandmas group. We actually know that there are hundreds of children being looked after informally by grandmas who maybe even in their parental experiences weren't that great and had issues themselves with child safety. But when it comes down to it, we stand up, we take responsibility. This is our cultural authority, and we're the people that have the rights to determine where this child is placed. So as I said, we did the cultural plan for this little fellow, and many have seen these little circles in child safety templates, but went to the nth degree of going through every single section of this and taking it back to the grandmother's law process, and why, if you're going to place this child, these are the things that you must consider. Not you might put a reference to, no, this is not negotiable. This is how we're going to place this child forever. And these things have to be acknowledged and grown along with the child's experience. So we didn't put in NAIDOC, we didn't put in, National Indigenous Day of the Child. These are all wonderful, I'm not disrespecting them. All I said in here was how you're going to identify the events and the things that are important are through talking to the family. You're not going to put in something just because you haven't thought of anything else. My grandson is on Kamilaroi country. I'm grateful for that, but he's not on our country. So there's a misunderstanding that just because he's, kind of close to where I'm from, is that good enough? No, it's not good enough for me that he doesn't get to go home and stick his hands in our dirt or his feet in our water. So near enough is not good enough. And a lack of knowledge about that is keeping children disconnected. The experience of the cultural plan for my grandson was that they quickly did one, because, as I said, little did I know he's going into long-term orders within 2 weeks. So it was literally a 2-sentence matter of saying that, we found grandma, she says she's Kamilaroi, so she's the holder of the stories, and that's about it. Bingo, cultural plan. I don't know what it's like in other states, but up here, cultural plans aren't needed to be reviewed. There's no actual crisis point or tick over point that says, oh, we must do them. They've just got to have one. So there was a risk there that my grandson was going to have a cultural plan, that just existed for 2 sentences for quite some time. So the next cultural plan that came through after I asked for a review was that the whole foster family, so foster parents, grandparents for both sides, aunts, uncles, cousins, and absolutely anybody they knew was listed, including some people that were put down as cultural mentors. And then there was me and my 2 sons, like we didn't have anyone else. The disrespect there was, of course, that the cultural mentors were nobody that I knew. I didn't know the names, so I don't even know who they are. You know who your mob names are, you just kind of say, oh, them fellas, name of that's and such, yeah, I know them. Yeah, never seen this name before in my life. So what's their influence on the cultural mentoring? I have no idea. I don't know what they're teaching him. I don't know what they're saying to him. I don't know what they're saying to the foster family. Have no idea. Generally, total insult, obviously. So what can happen with doing a proper cultural support plan following a grandmother's law process, or a much better process, is there were actually identifying the significant things that the family want to do. Although this was done for an Aboriginal child, I've also got connections with Torres Strait Islander families, and it has a very unique changes that they might need to make, but it would also work for their processes as well. So we're talking about things like what's required for this child around haircuts, what's this, what sort of sorry business things need to be undertaken. What do we need to do here? It's not just about going to NAIDOC and learning some paintings and reading a book about Dreamtime. We're going deeper than that right from the beginning, and what we're expecting for this child to be connected. I'm going to finish. I probably haven't said all the things I want to say, but really this is an experience. It's a journey. It's not a template that people can have and just fill in. It's an encouragement that people undertake how do you get the cultural authority to do a cultural plan for a child is actually the question. And what you do is you go to cultural grandmothers, bloodline grandmas. If you can't do that, go to a community grandma, get the bloodline grandma to identify somebody. This little fellow that we did the work for, they were a non-Indigenous family and had nominated a cultural grandma, and grandma was a bit surprised about that. The person was PNG. That was kind of like, oh, well, they're black, they'll do. So that cultural impact for that little child was from a completely different country, let alone nation, kin, skin group, whatever, he was getting a completely different cultural impact from that relationship. In February, my little grandson turned 5, and I was able to go down and celebrate the first birthday that we've ever had with him. And as we were sitting on country near fresh water, he just wandered over and had his very first grandma hug. And he came in, nestled in, and just stayed there. It was safe, comfortable. He wasn't fidgeting. He didn't want to leave. He just stayed there. And my friend who knew my son, his dad, from about a similar age, took that photo. And I'm sharing it because I believe that all kids need that grandma hug. They need that safety and security that no matter whatever happens, I've got somewhere to go. I know how that feels. I know it's safe. We get that from being on country. We get that from knowing who we are. We get that from a sense of safety and security that you can't get from anything else. I can't even explain in words what that experience is for me. I feel that every day when I look at that photo. And I think that's why I'm talking on behalf of grandmas. We have a role that was given to us by our grandmas, their grandmas, and every grandma that stepped before us to actually know that that's what kids need to grow up knowing. It won't matter whether they're in out-of-home care. We want to get them home, but what does that mean? Home is something that we can feel as well as we can touch. It doesn't necessarily attach to a person, but it attaches to everything that we are as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'm encouraging you, if you're a grandma, step up, even more than you might need to now. And I'm going to acknowledge one other grandma. We went on a grandma's camp after I did this work, and we got all the grandmas that we could think of that were either formally or informally working with their kids. And one of them said, I haven't seen my grandkids for 7 years. And I said, oh, honey, why is that? What's happened? And she said, well, child safety took them from the family. And I said, darling, they didn't take them from the family. They can never take them from the family. How can we help you ring up and get you to see your kids? And I think those are the things that have stayed with me. And I encourage, if you want to know more about this process, please get in contact with me. I'm only happy to share it. But the biggest thing is you can ask, anyone can ask permission to use this process. You just need to go into your community, speak to your grandmas, get the cultural authority to use it for any of the children that you know that are either on your country out of home care or your own kids that are off country, and bring them home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny, for sharing your work and that part of you, and a big part of yourself in that as well. And as well, the work of so many of our grandmothers across numerous communities. So I kind of feel like I just want to pause for a moment and give people a chance to reflect on that, which is why I'm drawing out the sentence.
And now I'll cry.
No, thank you very much, Jenny. And I'm sure lots of people will have a number of questions or comments for you, and we'll get to those in the future. But again, thank you very much for sharing your work. Now, finally, I'd like to introduce Jacinta Krakauer, my colleague on the Family Matters National Leadership Group, where she chairs the Family Matters Policy and Research Working Group. Jacinta is a Noongar woman who lives and works on Wurundjeri country in Naarm. She is a qualified social worker, employed as a lecturer and researcher with the University of Melbourne's Department of Social Work. Jacinta is currently undertaking her PhD within the department, due to complete this year, and her teaching and research expertise centres on child and family welfare with a particular focus on Indigenous peoples. Her PhD explores Indigenous peoples' understanding of cultural connection for our children in out-of-home care in Victoria, Australia. And just a quick plug, you can follow Jacinta on Twitter at Jacinta Krakauer. Thanks, Jacinta.
Thank you for the introduction, Paul. And what a terrific session we've had with Joe and Jenny. Thank you so much for sharing the presentations. It's been very emotional and very enlightening to hear about the work that you're doing. So as Paul said, my research is centred around Indigenous people's understandings of cultural connection. And I wanted to start by thinking about what culture is, and specifically what is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. And I want to plug in the plural here. We're talking about 200 plus different nation groups, each with their own distinct cultures. And cultures that have been very much fractured and disconnected and torn apart through the ongoing process of colonisation. So we're thinking about cultures as having evolved and changed in response to colonisation, and the ways in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people enact their cultures at the interface of a white Australian mainstream cultural environment. So these are some of the complexities that our children face in an out-of-home care context. And I wanted to point out here, when we're thinking about what is culture, and what is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, bring to mind some of the images that come up in your mind around what culture is. Are you thinking about a person with a didgeridoo, a person with a boomerang, NAIDOC week? Are you thinking about dance, paintings, ceremony? A lot of these are performative aspects of culture that are accessible to non-Indigenous society and have been transformed from being something that imparts value, knowledge, and wisdom to something that is now just constructed as a performative mechanism for Indigenous peoples to display their culture and to reinforce the importance of their cultures at the intersection of an environment that has historically undermined and tried to tear apart our ways of being, and has seen our ways of being and our cultures as inferior. So at this point, I wanted to think about the difference between surface culture and deep culture. So deep culture is the ways in which culture teaches us how to be in the world, the ways in which culture gives us a handbook or a guide for being in relation to others, for finding belonging with people of our culture, the ways in which culture imparts values, attitudes, cultural norms, ways to interact with family. And a lot of these are unseen. A lot of these are ways in which culture is imparted naturally in a family environment. So if you think about your own way of understanding your personal culture and how that came to be, a lot of that would have been learned, you know, in interaction with your parents, within the family environment over a long period of time. You wouldn't have learned about your culture through doing a painting in a one-off kind of situation, but actually it would have been in relationships with people. And here I want to talk about how cultural connection is actually not an outcome, but it is a lifelong process. And that's most noticeably demonstrated by the survivors of the stolen generations, who have experienced that disconnection and fracturing of their cultures and their identities, and have taken so many years to be able to find their place and their belonging. And in many ways, cultural connection, as we see it in out-of-home care, has emerged in response to a history and a present environment where systems are responsible for producing the cultural disconnection in the first place. So cultural connection now has emerged as a policy response to try to undo the harm that it has done. So for all of the workers that are here, I want you to think about the fact that actually part of the work that you do in trying to connect Aboriginal children to their culture is around trying to undo the harm that the system you are working in has produced. Cultural connection features because children have been removed from families and removed from culture in the first place. And the difficulties and the complexity of cultural connection is that it is fusing simultaneously the complexity of culture with the complexity of identity, and bringing those two processes together for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are at the intersection of a broader white Australian culture. And this leads to multiple issues with grappling with multiple identities in a context where your carers may not share your cultural identity as well, and therefore not actually know how to support it despite good intentions. And I want to talk here about cultural support plans and their intent and why they actually don't always work. So in Victoria, we do cultural support plans for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in an out-of-home care context. They detail things like the child's mob and ancestry group. They might detail ways in which the child might be able to connect to their culture. And they essentially try to detail knowledge and mechanisms to facilitate connection to culture. But problematically, their intent is to simulate a natural family environment where culture would naturally occur in a context where culture actually doesn't naturally occur. So I'll pause on that. They're trying to replicate an Aboriginal family's way of imparting culture, typically in a non-Indigenous environment where the carer does not possess the knowledge to facilitate connection to culture, simply because they are not from that culture and they do not have the knowledge necessary. They might not be in contact with community and have the appropriate mechanisms. And there's a lot of conceptual murkiness around the concept of cultural connection. There's a lot of different ways of understanding it. Even from a worker's perspective, there's a lot of variation throughout all of the different states and territories. And there's a lot of variation for Indigenous peoples themselves, their understanding of what their culture means to them and how best to connect themselves to their culture, sometimes in an environment where they have never known their culture. And I'm thinking here about infant removals and the complexities of an Aboriginal child trying to find identity, place, and belonging when they may never have been a part of an Aboriginal family and may not even know which family they belong to, and how complex that process is. I want to reiterate that this is a process, and it's a problem that out-of-home care systems and the law struggle to deal with. Process is difficult to deal with because it cannot be easily measured. It is something that occurs over time, and certainly for children and young people in out-of-home care, the process extends beyond their exit from the out-of-home care system. It extends beyond 18 years old. And that's, if the child stays in the system to that point. It is actually a lifelong process, and we see this with survivors of the stolen generations in their 50s and 60s and 70s, still trying to find belonging and place. Cultural connection is fundamentally about people and belonging. We all have a need as human beings to find belonging. That is our social need as peoples. And cultural connection is about our children finding belonging with their Aboriginal family and mob that they may have been disconnected from, that they may be trying to find. And it consists of a range of knowledges and mechanisms to facilitate it. And I'm going to talk about the various ways that there are to actually connect a child to their culture. Jenny and Joe have both spoken about their work and the ways in which they're trying to help children to find and connect to their culture. But fundamentally, it's about the ways that best suit the child, because we're thinking about the child's choice to connect to their culture. Connection to culture is not going to happen if a child doesn't want it. It's not going to happen if they feel shame at being around other Aboriginal people or embarrassment because they're being told to connect to a culture which is theirs that they don't feel like they belong to, particularly if they don't possess knowledge of it. And here, the feelings that a child holds about their culture are absolutely fundamental. If we want to begin with understanding how best to connect a child to their culture, it begins with talking to the child and getting to know the child, what works for them, where they're at, what knowledge they hold, and what kind of comfortable mechanisms are around for them if they want to connect to their culture, if that becomes a priority for them at that particular point in time. Because as we know, in child protection systems, sometimes children are in a state of survival where culture might not be important to them at that particular point in time, keeping in mind that it is a process. And children, particularly when they're adolescents, when they're grappling with identity issues, cultural connection and identity is going to feature as more and more important when they're trying to find their place and when they're asking themselves those fundamental questions around who am I? Where do I belong? Who do I belong to? Who claims me? These are the questions that in my research, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have said are fundamental. Cultural connection is around having knowledge of who I am, where I belong, who I belong to, and that conceptually this is quite murky because we're not just talking about people, but we're talking about other indicators of connection and belonging, like land, like totem, like spirituality and ancestors. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about cultural connection, it's quite a difficult concept for people who might be trained in Western psychology or Western social work or Western ways of understanding culture to understand that we're speaking about both living and non-living entities that help to foster and understand connection to culture. Living is in terms of, people, animals, totems, non-living, land, sea, ancestors, living or non-living, depending on how you look at it. And so to me, as I've gone through the process over the last 4 years of trying to understand how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people think about cultural connection, the importance of the family and of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is absolutely fundamental, because you cannot teach children about culture and you cannot teach them about where they belong when you're not from that same culture. A lot of children in out-of-home care tend to be taught a version of culture that is not mob specific, that kind of takes on board a sort of pan-Aboriginal view of the world, that doesn't give them information about their particular mob or country, or information about their particular, family ancestry or their story. And it's really important to impart mob-specific knowledge to children, because fundamentally, in order to belong, they need to know where they've come from, what their history is and what their story is. And absolutely, a lot of the work with cultural connection also involves working with the family and families that have been disconnected from culture themselves. We tend to focus in Australia on working with the child and seeing the child as the primary client, but we actually need to take a step back and take a holistic view of culture, one that works with the families that have also been disconnected and works holistically with those families. We're talking about family healing, about families also finding place and identity, because cultural connection and efforts to connect children to culture have emerged from the disconnection produced by colonisation. And that's something really important to remember. Not all of our families are going to know their culture, are going to know where they come from, and are going to know their stories. Because often these are the families that have been impacted by past child protection practices. And we're repeating that intergenerational cycle of involvement with child protection systems who have created the conditions where cultural connection is now necessary. And I want to think about how connection is about place, belonging, and identity. And it's also about families finding that identity. There's also a fundamental role for community here. It's about children having the choice to connect, families going along on that journey with them, but having the respected knowledge and wisdom of community in guiding that process. We talk about the rights of the child and the rights of the family. There's also a right of the community to ensure that our cultures survive. And listen here to what I'm critically saying. To ensure that our cultures survive means to ensure that we survive as peoples. There is an added dimension to cultural connection that is about communities rejecting and resisting assimilation in a white Australian culture and ensuring that we as peoples have the right to continue surviving in an environment where our survival has been threatened. And now our communities who possess that knowledge and want to impart the culture is so important, because we do not want to see future generations of Aboriginal children growing up and feeling like they don't belong as Aboriginal, feeling like they are in between two worlds, a white Australian world and some kind of Aboriginal world where they're at the intersections and they don't quite feel like they belong, and they take years and years to be able to find that connection and that place. We want to ensure that our Aboriginal children grow up knowing very well who they are, where they belong, and that they also have the knowledge to then pass that down to the future generations. We want to ensure the survival of us as peoples, and our cultures are the conduit through which we enable our survival. Now, I'm thinking about non-Indigenous carers and the complexities that it must be. There are so many complexities for non-Indigenous carers imparting a culture and enabling connection to a culture when they're not from the culture. And essentially, what non-Indigenous carers need to do when you're caring for an Aboriginal child is to actually become immersed within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community yourselves. Non-Indigenous carers actually need to go on a journey to ensure that their families are trying to impart and replicate as much of Aboriginal and Islander culture in their day-to-day lives as much as possible. Because culture is about daily interaction with culture, not those one-off events, not once a week. So for the non-Indigenous family, it's also about them going on a journey, because they can't effectively immerse an Aboriginal child in their culture if they're not also trying to be immersed in that culture either. And there are multiple ways to do that, but of fundamental importance is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves, whether that's through the family or the community, whether that's through community services, through cultural programs and activities. But those cultural activities and programs are important because it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people teaching it, enabling those relationships to occur, and through those relationships, enabling the necessary knowledge to be imparted. Think about if a child is doing artwork, if they're sitting doing a dot painting, if there's no Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person teaching them about the importance of story or the importance of technique or the importance of some of the values that might be passed or shared through that artwork, then essentially it's just mimicking artwork. That artwork is only important for culture when there is an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person imparting cultural knowledge through that process of teaching those values through the artwork. And I think sometimes in out-of-home care, we think that these outward-facing indicators of culture, like art, like didgeridoos and cultural performances or basket weaving, are enough. They're only enough when they involve Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, because it's through those relationships that Aboriginal children find their belonging. And that belonging is what cultural connection is about. And it's going to be different for a child depending on their age. You know, what's important for a 5-year-old is going to be vastly different for a teenager. But children need to find those connections and relationships. It could be through going to a play group and mixing with other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids and seeing themselves reflected in that environment. You know, so that environment's not as alien to them. They might actually feel like they belong. Part of the challenges with cultural connection is that children, Aboriginal and Islander children, are trying to find their place within a broader mainstream environment where they're subjected to racism, where they're experiencing negative portrayals and representations of their cultures, where they're seeing a lot of negative stereotypes perhaps in the media. And sometimes, depending on their history, and there's a lot of complexity here in child protection, as I'm sure you're all aware, but sometimes their only interactions with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are interactions with their parents that might not have been positive. So we're wanting to expose them as much as possible to a variety of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people so that they can see positive reflections of their culture, so that they can see themselves reflected in the world and find a way to belong to that culture. I want to talk here finally, my last part of the conversation about workers, because I notice quite a lot of people here are workers in child protection systems or in systems that work alongside child protection. And some of the challenges can be that culture can kind of come about as secondary in importance, depending on the needs of the child. Sometimes child protection systems are so focused on the immediate safety of a child that things like culture get pushed to the side. But essentially what your role is to try to help the child to find culture as much as possible and to make it occur as naturally as possible. And part of that involves working with the child and getting to know the child. And I can't emphasize how important that is. You know, I come from a casework background where I worked with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their carers in foster care, residential care settings. And I think too often we focus on building relationships with the carers and the adults, whether that be caseworkers or child protection staff or lawyers. We focus so much time working with the adults that we don't spend enough time getting to know the child. And we're trying to make decisions for the best interests of the child, for that child. But we can't know what cultural connection means to that child unless we stop and take the time to talk to them about it. We can't know what's going to work for that child unless we ask them about their culture, how they see their culture, whether or not their culture is important to them, whether they feel shame about their culture, whether they feel out of place. So the beginning point has to be building a relationship with the child and having regular conversations about culture as naturally as possible. This is not about getting a form and writing down the child's responses to a series of questions, but it's actually about building the relationship up with the child and asking them about their feelings. Do they feel connected to their culture? It's probably the best question to start off with. We can't know how to connect a child if we don't know if they feel connected to their culture in the first place, or if they feel disconnected. And if they want to know more about their culture, what specifically do they want to know? What knowledge might be lacking? What mechanisms might work for them? I also want to talk about how important it is for caseworkers to work holistically with the families, because part of connecting children to culture is also cultural healing with the families who may have been disconnected from culture themselves. So we need to think holistically, and we also need to get to know the community and work with the community. Aboriginal community-controlled organisations tend to have amazing programs around cultural activities and connecting kids to culture, because a lot of them are staffed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have knowledge and experience of their culture. You know, those cultural programs come about through having knowledge of culture. And the worker's role as well is also to guide the carers. And part of the cultural support plans are to give the carers some guidance in enabling connection to culture in a day-to-day natural environment. I spoke earlier about cultural support plans and why they don't always work. And I think that's because they sometimes sit there as a static document. Whereas when we're thinking about what cultural connection is, it's a process, it's a lifelong process that evolves and changes. So if you have a static document, it's not going to be effective. It needs to be updated regularly. It needs to change with the child, and it needs to change with the child's evolving feelings. Their evolving feelings about their identity, their evolving knowledges about their cultures, and also with the evolving understanding of what works for them, what mechanisms might work for them and what might not. Okay, so I think I've definitely taken up my 25 minutes. I could talk about this forever, but you've all heard enough from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jacinta. And look, I think I speak for everyone on the call when I say that we could probably sit here and listen to you talk about it forever. We would be quite happy to do that. And look, I want to thank you for your insights and obviously your passion about this great topic. And I want to take this moment to thank Joe and thank Jenny and Jacinta for their thought-provoking insights. For me, I certainly heard clearly that it is a lifelong process, that it is about relationships, and it's about how we come to understand the world and our position in it, our role in our families, in our communities, and our place in society. And that the focus of this process is about the lived experience of culture, rather than the consumption or the performative aspects of culture. Which we perhaps tend to see more in out-of-home care or in our cultural plans. That's more focused on distinct events and activities. And I think in the acknowledgement that it's this ongoing work that if we, or at least for me, if we don't deliver on it for kids in out-of-home care, then I think we have to acknowledge that what we're actually doing is passing on that work to the kids and the families themselves later in life. And as Jacinta said, we're repeating that intergenerational cycle of disconnection. But as I said at the start, I'm going to do as little talking as I can today because we've got three great panelists and we've got lots of people who I'm sure have lots of questions. Unfortunately, the chat feed has just been overwhelmed with people thanking Jacinta and our speakers. So please bear with me. I did recall seeing a question earlier about reflections on life storybooks. So perhaps Jenny, if you'd like to start. So what are your views with respect to life storybooks, you know, the used in out-of-home care to provide information to kids as they grow up about their family and their story?
Yeah. Interesting question. I think they have their place. They are only part of a massive toolbox that needs to be used. And I think, Jacinta, you've eloquently put what culture is. I have a personal view that culture is a word that tries to explain a life and lived experience that isn't a word. So when we try to put a life story into a book, we're probably trying to do exactly the same thing. Another life, I actually was a carer assessor and facilitated carer training down in New South Wales. So life story books were available in that process to carers. So there was a non-Indigenous version and an Indigenous version, and the only difference was the actual colours that were used. So it's an Indigenised, you know, or white process of telling a story. I think it's only a tool. I think it's a toolbox to develop pictorially things that have memories. Often we're a very visual mob, and they can be used, but they certainly can't be the only tool used to tell a life story, because again, it's only a version of that story. And I think, Jacinta, your reference of asking a child, you know, what their experience of the culture is, how important is this to them, is exactly it. My grandmother's law process is about placing it. If we want to actually place a child culturally with that authority process, that's what you do. What we do from then on is how are we enriching this experience for a child. So I think life story books are fabulous for what they are intended for, but they cannot be the only thing that a poor foster carer is given to say, hey, this is how you record this child's life and the important parts of their culture to them. So I would never say don't use them, but I would definitely say don't rely on them.
Thanks, Jenny. Joe? Put you on the spot.
No, I was thinking about that too. Like, I know, having worked in out-of-home care too for a while, and particularly being doing family research and genealogy work with 300 kids in one agency. I think the sad reality is life story books are good, but they're not necessarily followed and completed by the caseworkers and/or ask the children to be involved as well. I know in some of them where, you know, the book started with such enthusiasm, but as they pick up another child and their case management load, it doesn't get focused on. But the life story book is about developing that child and showing their history from when they're away from their family as well, so that they can refer back to it at any point in time. But it's not seen by some caseworkers as important to maintain that ongoing connection with their family, but it's good to have that there. And I'm thinking of one child in particular who parents live in the same community that they're living with a carer with, have minimal contact at all, but they know that they're there. But how does that then influence the life story book? Because there's not a lot of focus on having the regular contact as well with their family. But yeah, so life story books are good, but they can be a challenge. But it's about maintaining that and bringing them back so that it's more face-to-face rather than just in a book. And then connecting with their family, their bloodlines and their culture, rather than, you know, this is a bit of a story about what you've been and where you've been and what you're doing now.
Thanks, Joe. Jacinta, did you want to add to Jenny and Joe's comments?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Joe and Jenny that they can be useful, life story books and cultural support plans, but they shouldn't be solely relied on. But the other thing that I was thinking about was sometimes they serve as a very useful record of knowledge that's specific to the child and their mob group for them to reflect on later. And I think particularly when a child is going through those adolescent years of identity, conflict and struggle, those sort of documents can be very powerful for them, particularly if they're at a point in their lives where culture is not actually occurring naturally or on a day-to-day basis. So we shouldn't underestimate, I guess, the power that they can have for children to actually have access to their stories and their histories and their knowledge. Because when I was talking about belonging earlier, a lot to do with belonging is actually having the knowledge of where you come from and where your ancestry and your kinship is from. And that's very, very important and powerful for an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. So those life story work and those cultural support plans can be really useful for children. However, I've got to say that they're only really useful when they're actually involving the family and recording the family's stories. They're not useful if they just have, you are from X country. Like for me, if I had a document that said you are from Noongar country, that wouldn't be enough. I need to know which Noongar families I belong to. And that's the information that comes from the family. Those are things we can't just find on the internet. So cultural support plans and life story work are most effective when they involve the family and the community. And when the child is involved with them as well, because if the child doesn't know they exist, then they're not going to be useful. The child needs to know that they actually have access to this knowledge, and they should be involved in the process as well.
Thanks, Jacinta. So really that, you know, to put it in a sentence, you don't learn who you are from a book, but it can reinforce those messages and that sense of identity that you have if it's done well and it's done with family. But it's not a replacement for those important relationships that everyone's spoken about. And I think that point that you raised about they're only really useful if people know, but if the kids know about them, is a really important one. And we know from various reviews that things like life story work, but also cultural support plans are often not things that children and young people know about themselves. And we did have a question about cultural support plans. And in particular, do you think that child protection workers should be the ones doing a child's cultural support plans? Or should that sit with Aboriginal community controlled organisations? Joe, what did you think? I know you have a background in some of the work.
So in one of the organisations that I was working with, we did a whole lot of training around cultural support plans. The tool that the Aboriginal Cultural Connections Questionnaire we developed through and using now with some of the organisations has that element where you can actually ask the children and young people about what their understanding and knowledge is on culture. And if that's the first time that they've been asked, then that's a way that they can identify what they need to know and what they need to learn. And it's coming directly from them rather than in a machine place where previously cultural support plans were written by caseworkers. And I know when you go from your interim order to your final order, there's some cultural support plans that come from Google. And I know that's come up in one of the comments here that a lot of those plans have been sponsored by Google. Because when you look at some of that stuff, it's like, oh my God, they don't even know exactly where this child's coming from, let alone what their totem is, let alone their family names, let alone their family connections in that community. And it's always assumed that that's going to be all right for that child. But by getting the child, again, going back to that tool, getting the child to first identify what they do and don't know about their culture, whether they're living on country, whether they're off country, whether they want to know more about it, which is the best way of doing that, should be the first case. And then you use those as in that deficit space to then engage with their family to start building that cultural support plan around the child and their family first, to then get that information so that they can then be more confident. But, you know, caseworkers should be facilitating that process. And if it's an Aboriginal organisation or even a non-Aboriginal organisation, they need to be engaging an Aboriginal person to help facilitate those conversations in that space with their families. And I think that would be the better way of doing it rather than just, you know, Google, yeah, this is where they're from, not knowing the level of detail of the clan or any of that stuff. It's the only way I think we need to move forward in getting that happening, and so that they're confident culturally in who they are and where they're from moving forward.
Thanks, Joe. Jacinta, you spoke a little bit about cultural support plans and the role of workers. What are your thoughts here?
I personally think that not enough time is actually spent developing the cultural support plans, particularly when they're done at a department level. You know, where departments are quite stretched and under-resourced as it is. So when they're tasked with developing the cultural support plans, sometimes only a few hours is put into a process that should actually take about 3 months. In Victoria, we've gone through a process of radically reshaping the way that we do cultural support plans, and they're all done through Aboriginal community controlled organisations and endorsed by the CEO of an Aboriginal community controlled organisation. And I've been told that they typically take between 12 to 18 weeks to get those plans done effectively, because that's the time it takes to engage with the family appropriately and to find information, particularly when the family don't readily have that information there. So I think, yes, ACCO is the best placed to develop those cultural support plans. And I think really Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders staff need to be working on those cultural support plans and fostering those relationships. And like we said before, involving families and the child in the process. I might just have a Paul, there was a chat box around how early do you think children should be involved in discussions around cultural connection? And I really think it's as early as the child can talk. Because when we're thinking about cultural connection, it's also around identity. So it's around the child knowing that they're Aboriginal in the first place. And that can start from when a child is, you know, speaking age, 2 or 3 years old, and being able to say, hey, I'm Aboriginal. I'm from, you know, Yorta Yorta country. And that's, children can be involved in that right from the beginning. Cultural connection is about trying to foster pride and belonging in that identity. So it can start very early on. In terms of choice, around a child's choice to connect, children need to be given as much opportunity as possible. What I meant when I was talking about choice is that you essentially can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can give a child all the access, but at the end of the day, it's up to them to engage in the way that they want to. I'll pass back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Jacinta. And, you know, I was going to cast to that question. I had it on my list. We'll get to that a bit later, but I think that's a really important point there, because I think about, I suppose, my reflection on it, coming from my background in psychology once upon a time, is that it's a developmental process, right? And I think about my own kids going through that. I think the language of choice, as you've clarified, is not about whether you when you choose to identify or things like that. I think, you know, you don't choose who you are. You're born who you are, and our job is to acculturate children into their culture and socialize them into their culture. And as I say, I remember that sort of stepping through that process with my daughter and my son. Their journeys with that have been very different because they engage with that information in different ways. But our responsibility is to share it with them and to give them those opportunities. So I find that interesting. But Jenny, you talked a bit about your experiences and in your family, but also with grandmother's law in Queensland. What's the role of community-controlled organisations in facilitating this process? And as Jacinta has pointed to, drawing on Megan Mitchell's question, when does it start?
This is a really hard question for me. I've got really different levels of experience to answer this question, and I'm just going to try and sort of get that into a logical progression. So I think in my current role as a sector development officer, my role is encouraging and supporting member orgs who are community control organisations who are funded in a child protection space. And I think what I've experienced in working in over 3 states is, unfortunately, we don't have any consistency because child protection legislation is to the state and not federal. So everything differs from one place to another. So in New South Wales, cultural plans can be done by a supporting NGO. So my personal experience in that is it was appalling. So the second cultural plan that my grandson had was a little bit more, you know, fun, but it had, as I said, all the foster people who are non-Indigenous before us. They're the people who implement the plan. They're not on the plan. They aren't. It's their culture that he has to learn. This one. So that was kind of offensive to start with. So I just went back with everybody I know, everyone I could possibly mention, to say, no, we have family, we have relationships, we have, you know, it's not just me and 2 sons here. We have a very extensive and extended family network and community and people that we class as family. but on that cultural plan was his birth date, which was clearly a cut and paste from somebody else, because he suddenly turned out to be 8 years older. And I found that, you know, this is the lack of detail and compassion and commitment to developing proper cultural plans. So the experience in Queensland is that they're done mainly, priorities with the child protection system is through the agencies here with the CSOs. So just recently we had under 3 permanency reviews in a very short amount of time before Christmas, and I undertook 37 of those as a critical friend, and all 37 were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and there wasn't one of them that had a current cultural plan that you could acknowledge. Most of the CSOs thought that that was actually mentioned and included in the case plan, so that gave them like a little paragraph, you know, in the template to write. And so, you know, there's 37 kids now that are going to get a cultural plan, you know, as a priority. But in that, I understand and absolutely purport that you cannot do a cultural plan. I don't mind who has the authority in doing the cultural plan, whether it's a non-Indigenous CSO or whoever it is. But if you're not involving the family and you're not involving them in a very extensive process to figure out what they want for this child, then don't have one, because it's more insulting to have that than it is not to have one. Cultural plans are essential for these children to grow into who they are, where they belong. There's an 18-year-old at the moment that I'm aware of who's never set foot in a community. He's been in a non-Indigenous placement, but now he's transitioning into his adulthood and his independence. And what we want for these children is that if he wants to go home to his remote community and walk in, even though he's never been there, they're going to say, "Who you?" And he's going to say, "Oh, I'm so-and-so's grandson, da-da-da-da." And they go, "Oh, welcome home, come meet your family." Because he's actually been connected, even though he's been off country for such a long time. Now, I wouldn't want that as the priority. I want him to have visited the community. I want it, you know, I want him to know and experience the dirt under his toes. I want him to, you know, bathe in the dam. I want him to do whatever he needs to do. But I mean, essentially, if we do have children out of home care not going home till after they're 18, they're still going home, and they still need to understand that if that's my choice to go and visit and know that I belong there, that's where I want to go. Instead of them running at 14 and 15 because they don't belong and they're struggling with that identity, and we're getting now kids on the street making a family of their own with people that have had like experiences, and now we have a youth justice problem, which is another conversation for another day. But I think you know, that's the importance of a cultural plan that actually works, that actually is relevant, and yes, involves the child from any age. I think as a baby, we're already feeling culture. We may not know what it is. There may not be a response to that, but as soon as you've got a baby touched by mum, we're starting a cultural journey.
Thanks, Jenny. And Joe, I know you've had some background and you mentioned it briefly about the quality assurance framework in New South Wales and the questionnaire. So what's your perspective regarding this issue of what age this become, you know, we start working with kids?
When we started to map the actual process forward, what happened was they developed what they call the domain, and the domain looked at the different ages from birth through to transitioning out. So, you know, the first 2 to 3 years is all around experiential stuff. And, you know, one of the things that Uncle Widdy, again, one of the uncles from the stolen generation often refers to is when he was removed from his family, he was removed from his mother's smell. And we all know the importance of his mother's smell in terms of that comfort and bonding side of it. So we talked about how then we could allow that to happen, particularly when we know the reality, we have babies taken from hospitals. How do they bond and connect with their family, with their mother in particular, let alone their culture? And what tools we can do. The tool that we did develop was for 7 to 18 or 7 to 17. Because at that stage then it's a learned process where you could look at some of the basic stuff to the complex things, and then get them to totally understand. When we tested it in a number of different locations, you know, we had a 5-year-old because we thought we'd just check to see what the 5-year-olds would say. And at that stage, their concept around Aboriginality wasn't there. They just, you know, they lived in a family. And they had some family members who had darker skin than others. They didn't actually say, yes, I am Aboriginal, because they already lived in that environment, living with an Aboriginal family. So it wasn't, you know, and when we would say to her, are you Dungari? She goes, no, I'm me, and this is my family. But as she grew older, she could understand the concept of what that actually meant, because she'd never said, we never used to say to her, come here, you little Aboriginal girl, or you little Dungari girl. We just say, come here, baby, or whatever. So it's about the use of language too when they're younger, as to how that they identify within themselves. But she would go camping, she would go fishing, she would go to all the places, and she lived culture. Whereas if you look at a child that's not in an Aboriginal family, that total disconnect. And then how do you then get that non-Aboriginal family to embrace the culture? And it's not just about ticking the box by saying sorry day or NAIDOC week or any of that stuff. One of the things that came out of that tool is we actually got the caseworkers to look at the results with the young people and talk them through before it even went anywhere near developing a cultural support plan, because then that gave them ideas about, you know, one of them, when again in the tester that we did, or the pilot, we asked, you know, who their mob was. And of course, this young person didn't know who they were. So the caseworker then said, well, this gives me an opportunity now to work with the family to then say, okay, let's look at that. When we have our next contact with mum and dad, let's explore that together. And so that you can come back and say, well, now I know who my mob is. And I know who I'm connected to, because we know in society, and you know, this happened to my son, who's currently living in Darwin at the moment. He went to Alice Springs in the last 2 weeks ago, and he went to one of the middle schools there. He introduced himself as being from a Dungari man. He's blonde hair, blue eyes, as milky as milking could be. You know, as soon as he opened his mouth, he's right. But, you know, he introduced himself. One of the staff members and a local man come up and said, oh, you said you're from Dungari. I've got family in Dungari. Like my sister married a Dungari man. And here he is in the middle of nowhere connecting to this guy who's actually married in.
I hope we haven't lost Joe. I'm very sorry, everybody.
Into our family. So his sister, we can then, oh, sorry, I'm back again, sorry. So, you know, he's now able to say, well, next time I go to Alice Springs, I've got that family connection there, because his nephews are my cousins. So we know that happens. And if you can explain that, and that was why at the time I was passionate about that questionnaire, because if we gave them those basic tools to survive in the real world, then at least they can say that. But also, one of the other things we talked about is why aren't cultural support plans written in a way that are like it's when you're, you know, go through the divorce situation, where, you know, you have custody for this time of the week and that time of the week, school holidays. Why aren't kids in out-of-home care go back to country every school holidays to connect with their families? And that's written into their cultural support plan, because then that allows them to say that when they do go home, they know who their mob is. And when their mob comes to town, they know that they can connect with them. One of the guys that we had, he was transitioning out. So he was about 6 weeks shy of being 18. And the comment that he made to us at the time we did the survey with him, I wished I would have done this 5 years ago, so I know who my mob is. So I'm not lost here in the system working out who do I go home to when I age out. And I hate that terminology, aging out of the system, but that's the reality. But it's about how do we give them those experiences to make them, you know, further embrace who they are, but also connect their dots back so that their journey is not going to be like some of the uncles of the stolen generation. And I saw one of the questions up here about the stolen generations where, and again, I'll use Uncle Woody, he said he wasn't welcome back, because when he went home after being in that institution for all those years, he walked home another person. He was talking differently. He was told, you know, because they were whitewashed, they were told that they weren't Aboriginal, they had to be white. So how do we get that happening? We have to step back and you know, we're looking even at a Kinchela Boys Home perspective, how do we do reintroductions back to community, to some of those families who were never connected back? And it's that, you know, the welcome home ceremonies that we also should be doing with some of our kids who aren't on country all the time. So I think I'll stop there.
No, thanks, Joe, and thanks for touching on the stolen gens and sharing Uncle Whitty's experiences. Such a staunch advocate for our community, so I want to acknowledge him and all the men of kinship. In fact, all of the survivors of the stolen generations who are such strong voices in this area. We've had a few good, we've had lots of great comments, but I just wanted to point to, so Rowena mentioning around genogram mapping as an important step in that process in engaging with families and understanding who's there. And also Peter McGilvray talking about or raising the importance of that cultural lens as a starting point for how we understand these issues and how we approach these things from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective, as opposed to kind of dominant Western frameworks. And I think that's perhaps could and should be a future session all of its own that we could get into. That's a very meaty kind of topic that we can unpack. But I did want to, I suppose there are two things that I wanted to touch on. One was that question about how do we best support connection to culture for children who are from stolen generations or who are from families who have experienced multiple generations of removal. What would be the advice that you would give in those circumstances about how we work with kids and families in strengthening or reconnecting those important connections? Jenny, did you want to say something? Did you want to take a first go at that? Sorry.
Yeah, I can have a shot, and my esteemed colleagues can build on it. Look, from a personal perspective, I kind of see my own experience discovering who I am with my cultural heritage as a reverse of the stolen generation. It was a choice of my grandfather not to acknowledge his background because my father's entire family were born in the 30s. My dad's the oldest, and they would have been removed. So it was quite clear cut. My grandfather was born in 1899. He's an illegitimate child to a white woman. So you can imagine the lack of stories we have about that. It was just not spoken about. I'm also turning 60 this year, so I was educated in a time in rural New South Wales where there was no Aboriginal history. It just didn't exist. And there was no language, there was no art, there was nothing. We weren't Aboriginal, we were just people like everybody else. So my growth to become who I am meant that I was actually trying to find the missing piece that I never knew was missing. And that was a very gradual process, most likely as an adult more than as a child. But as a child, I knew something was missing. So that's why the time for me in Arnhem Land was actually so important, because there were other women, older women, who sat down and took the time to fill in my gaps. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that regardless of whether we can find a bloodline grandma or a community grandma or a group of elder grandmas or granddads or whoever it is, that we are always placed. You know, we will always, like Joe said, we will always find someone we're connected with. We will, I don't know how we can heal the wounds of a stolen generation. It's just like, it's going to be an ongoing process, but let's create more generations of those. So I think the work that we have to do is like an 18-year-old who can walk in and say, this is where I'm from because these are the stories that I've been told. Who knows who those connections will form. Those gaps can't continue for people. We can't keep eating away and having health impacts from these issues. We can't still keep having morbidity rates coming from this intergenerational trauma. So whilst I don't have an answer for that stolen generation thing, I'm sorry, in that essence, my own journey of healing has been through sitting down in the dirt, beautiful red Arnhem Land dirt. It's like going to church every day as a work experience, but they took the time.
There was the touch, there was the holds of the hands. It's okay, honey, we can heal this. It's the time taken through that process that everybody that's come across my life has given me the confidence to say, I know who I am and I know where I belong now. And I'm really, really saddened that I wasn't able to experience that with my own granddad and my dad. My dad only acknowledged this to me, and we spoke about it only probably 5 years before he passed away, because that was when he had the, I don't know, the sense that he said, oh, you do know that we've got some Aboriginal heritage. And I said, yes, Dad, because I am. And the relief that he had was far better than the relief I had by saying it, because I'd already got there. And here's a man in his late 70s, finally having some courage to have a conversation with his only child, that this is where we came from. So, sorry, now it's emotional. It's never too late. It's just not.
Thanks, Jenny. And look, I'm supposed to be wrapping up now, but I'm going to use my prerogative to at least get one more question in there, because I think this is such an important conversation. And it picks up on a question that's been asked around how do we navigate when adolescents are in that sort of period of identity formation where they're trying to work out who they are, and they have picked up and internalized negative stereotypes or negative self-talk about being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Jacinta, I might start with you on that one, if that's okay.
Sure. I suppose I might just pick up on that previous question as well. How do we support connection for children whose identities and cultures might have been fractured? And here I want to reflect on one of the stories of a young person that I interviewed for my PhD research, who had no knowledge of where she was from and hadn't been given that information because of that intergenerational removal. And her advice was, put me in a daily culture thing until I say that I don't want it. Just give me the opportunities, as many opportunities as possible. And while when I interviewed her at the age of 21, she still didn't know who she was, who her connections came from, or where her mob were, what she had done was be able to form connections with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and to create her own sense of belonging and her own sense of being Aboriginal. And that identity was very personal to her. It was not about saying, I am from this mob, but it was about saying, I am so-and-so, and I am Aboriginal. I don't know where I'm from, but I have connections with these people, and I live on this country. So thinking about identity is actually a very personal thing. And the best way to support it is actually just to give children opportunities to create relationships and to create belonging so that they don't feel lost. So thinking about, children at the age of sort of 15, when they might be struggling with identity, again, it's that very personal issue. What does identity mean for that child? How do they want to form that identity? And children will develop a sense of identity with or without the support of child protection systems. Sometimes those will be negative identities if they've been exposed to negative stereotypes. The best way to counteract that is through positive relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We can hold up images of idols, but it's those relationships that influence people most. So those connections to community enable belonging, but they enable children to feel like they belong. Even if that community is not their own, they might create their own sense of community in the country that they're living in. So again, I've got to reiterate the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the ways in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people find connection with one another. We've had to do that to survive as a culture, and that's why I'm thinking how culture evolves. People who have lost those connections will find ways to make it work for them. So we can't have a predefined notion of what it means. That's what I mean about starting with the child, working from where they're at.
Yeah, thanks, Jacinta. And once again, it all goes back to relationships. Look, I do need to wrap up. I just wanted to very quickly, because Rowena's been very patient and has asked it twice. Do any of our panel have experience with Tracy Westerman's Child Protection Cultural Competency Profile tool? Or perhaps that's a conversation that we can take offline, Rowena.
I know of it.
Yep.
I haven't actually been able to look at it. My understanding, though, is that it's quite separate from the conversation we're having today. What we're talking about today is about how we can foster cultural connection for Aboriginal children and youth that are part of child protection systems. So looking at the perspective and the experiences of the child, whereas I believe Dr. Westerman's Child Protection Cultural Competency Profile tool is actually about skilling up the workforce and increasing the cultural capability of the child protection workforce. So helping, I guess, child protection professionals understand the importance of cultural connection and what it might mean. But I think that's, a conversation that can be followed up offline as well, Paul, because I'm sure there's a lot more nuance and complexity to that tool as well.
Thanks, Jacinta, and thanks, Rowena, for those questions. I do have to finish now. I'm very sorry for those questions I didn't get to. Again, we could have perhaps scheduled this for the whole day and still been here talking into the night. But I want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers, Joanne Kelly, Jenny Parsons, and Jacinta Krakauer. We've benefited from your knowledge and expertise today, and I also acknowledge that we have a number of carers dialing in, and I wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge you and the role that you play in our children's lives. A reminder that the recording of this event will be available and it will be sent around in an email next week for those who have signed up to the Family Matters campaign. So make sure you head over to our website and join up as we work to eliminate the overrepresentation of our kids in out-of-home care. When that recording becomes available, make sure that you send it out to all your colleagues as well. Have a yarn about it in your teams, at work or in supervision, and think about how you can put today's insights into action. The connections that we've talked about today are critical to the full implementation of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principles. But more than that, they're the cornerstone of identity, our sense of belonging, and our understanding of the place in the world. So really critical that we get this right for our kids and our families. So again, to finish, please remember to visit our Family Matters website, sign up for the campaign. We look forward to seeing you at our final event for the National Week of Action, which is tomorrow. Those of you who would like to hear more from Jacinta, who will be hosting that session, which will be an important practice and research forum on how to prevent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies from being removed from their families and communities. As always, you can register for that event over at the Family Matters website, and we'll see you there tomorrow. Thank you very much.